This video is brought to you by GiveWell. After more than half a century, the Assad era appears to be over. Less than 2 weeks after Islamist rebels began a surprise offensive out of their stronghold in Syria's Idlib province, forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad have given up arms, and Assad himself has apparently fled and is now in Moscow, where he's been given asylum. So in this video, we're going to look at this weekend's astonishing events and what the post-Assad era might hold for Syria. So let's take a quick look at what's happened over the past few days. When we did our last video on Syria, which was written on Friday morning, we said that the rebels were on their way to the city of Homs, which lies in between Hama, Syria's fourth largest city, which the rebels captured on Thursday, and Damascus, Syria's capital. By the time we released that video though, it was basically out of date. On Saturday evening, Assad's forces had given up not just Homs, but also the capital Damascus. This is both because Assad's forces were just crumbling en masse anyway, but also because Damascus was essentially surrounded. Not only were the rebels coming from the north, down from Homs, but a new rebel force had also emerged in the southern province of Daraa, which was pushing into the southern outskirts of Damascus by Saturday morning. Similarly, by Saturday, it had become overwhelmingly clear that neither of Assad's longtime allies, Russia or Iran, were going to come to his rescue. The head of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is basically an umbrella organization for Iran's proxy militias in Iraq, released a statement saying that what was happening in Syria is an internal matter, while the Russian embassy in Damascus started telling Russians to leave Syria as soon as they could. And Bloomberg even reported on Friday that Russia had no plan to save Assad as long as the Syrian president's army continued to abandon its positions, citing a person close to the Kremlin. In retrospect, it looks like both Russia and Iran essentially decided that, given the relatively high odds of Assad's regime collapsing, they didn't think it was worth providing support, leaving Assad essentially stuck in a vicious cycle. As his odds of collapse increased, the incentive to support him waned, so the odds of Russia or Iran providing support decreased, which in turn increased his odds of collapsing. There were reports that Assad desperately appealed for help from his Arab neighbors, including the UAE, Egypt, and Jordan, trying to convince them that the rebels would turn Syria into an unstable jihadist regime with ISIS-esque ambitions, but to no avail. In the early hours of Sunday morning, when it became clear that Assad's regime was finished, Mohammed al-Jalali, the Syrian prime minister, released a video message announcing the regime's intention to hand control to what he called a transitional government, presumably led by the rebels. So what happens next? Well, it all depends on the new rebel-led government, which will probably be dominated by HTS, the rebel group that led the offensive out of Idlib. HTS are headed up by a guy called Ahmed Hussein al-Sharaa, usually known by his nom de guerre as Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, or just Jolani. Jolani used to be the leader of al-Qaeda's Syrian offshoot, the al-Nusra Front, and is considered a terrorist by the US State Department, which has a $10 million bounty on him. As we said in our last video, there's an optimistic and a pessimistic take here. The optimistic take is that Jolani will pursue a relatively moderate, inclusive style of governance. Jolani and HTS have tried to convince Syria and the international community that this is what they're going for. HTS have released a number of statements insisting that they will respect minority rights, and Jolani himself gave an interview to CNN last week, where he said that, whilst HTS would still pursue a, quote, Islamist style of government, it would be focused on building institutions and creating, quote, a legal framework that protects and ensures the rights of all. In that same interview, Jolani claimed that his thinking had evolved since his 20s and 30s, when he was a key part of al-Qaeda. In this context, it's worth mentioning that HTS have pursued a relatively inclusive form of government in Idlib over the past few years, where minorities are apparently treated relatively well. For instance, Christians are allowed to practice Mass, and once it had taken over, HTS returned land back to its previous owners, even if they were Christian or Druze. Now, to be clear, it's not like Idlib was a liberal democracy during its time under HTS. There weren't elections, and Jolani's political opponents were still jailed. Nonetheless, it wasn't the Taliban-style Islamic theocracy that many Syrians feared, and it's a symptom of Jolani's wider ideological shift away from ISIS-style Islamism, which focused on creating a transnational caliphate, and was framed against the collective West, towards an Islamist-tinged form of Syrian nationalism, which is focused on reconstructing the Syrian nation and framed against the Assad regime. The pessimistic take, however, is that, like Ayatollah Khomeini in the 70s or the Taliban a couple of years ago, Jolani is just playing it up for the cameras, trying to convince the West and Syria's neighbours to let him take power, and that once he does, he'll impose a brutal Islamic theocracy. Even if Jalani himself tries to maintain a more moderate politics, as HTS extends its control out of Idlib across Syria, it will have to rely on local jihadist groups for support, who will be harder to control and might push for a more extreme version of Islamic law. As a final thing, it's worth noting that while the rebels now control the vast majority of Syria's population centres, they don't yet control the entire country territorially. On Sunday afternoon, Israel announced the creation of a, quote, buffer zone around the Golan Heights, and the Kurds still control the northeast of the country, with the Euphrates River acting as a sort of de facto border. While it's hard to see the rebels starting a war with Israel anytime soon, what happens to the Kurds is very much an open question. While HTS have insisted that they'll protect the rights of Syria's minorities, including the Kurds, their main international backer is Turkey, and Erdogan's strategic priority is squashing the Kurdish state in northeastern Syria. Even if HTS themselves decide to let the Kurds be, the Turkish military and other Turkish-backed rebels, like the Syrian National Army, might take this opportunity to launch a full-on assault. There have already been reports in the past 24 hours of Turkish-backed militias assaulting Kurdish-held positions on the west side of the Euphrates, including Manbij and Deir ez-Zur. And if this assault expands towards the Kurdish heartland to the east of the Euphrates, the Kurds could be in trouble, unless the US, which maintains a small troop presence in the region, decides to step in to support their longtime allies, although this is something that Trump has ruled out. Now, when you make a big purchase, say a car or a new mattress, how do you make sure that you're making the right choice? You could rely on all of the marketing copy in the product's ads, but many people find they need an independent resource that's rigorous and trustworthy. Today's sponsor, GiveWell, provides that independent resource for a different kind of purchase, a donation. For 17 years, GiveWell has been researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. That's things like bed nets to prevent malaria. It costs about $5 to provide one net. Nets can reduce the number of malaria infections. Enough nets and a large enough drop in infections can save a life in expectation. Together, over 125,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. I particularly like GiveWell as it ensures that your money is doing a lot to help those the most in need. Here at TLDR, we're big believers in doing research to find out what's really going on, and that's exactly the approach that GiveWell takes to charities. If you've never donated to GiveWell's recommended charities before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org and pick YouTube, then enter TLDR News at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GiveWell from TLDR News to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or to find out more.